In this video, we'll set up an Android emulator, which will allow us to run and deploy an Android app directly from Android Studio. So Android development obviously requires us to try the apps that we're building while they're being built. So every few minutes you want to run the app that you're developing in order to make sure that you haven't introduced any bugs or crashes. And so one option to do this is by plugging in a physical Android device into your computer and running the app on your phone. Usually it's easier to use an emulator. Then an emulator runs the app in a virtual Android phone that's running on your computer through Android Studio. And Android from Google now includes an emulator that works really well. So previously, because the Android emulator actually wasn't very good and wasn't very performant, you'll come across a lot of articles and guides that might mention Genymotion. So Genymotion was a third-party company that developed a better emulator compared to the stock emulator from Android Studio. But typically, you shouldn't really need Genymotion anymore. To get started, let's open up Android Studio. And what you want to do is open up the AVD, which is the Android Virtual Device Manager. So one option to do that is there should be an option next to the green triangle to say Open AVD Manager. And the other way to get to it is go to Tools from the menu and then click on AVD Manager. So I have a few virtual devices already set up. You may not have any. So what you want to do is click on Create Virtual Device. And so here you have an option for what kind of virtual device you want to set up. And this is actually another reason why having an emulator or a virtual device is much more preferable compared to having a physical device. With a virtual device, you can actually have any kind of phone that you may not be able to find a physical phone for, and you can have any screen resolution, any size, and so on. And so why don't we start with the Pixel 2, so you can kind of see the resolution, density, and size for each of these. Click on Next, and you'll now need to select a system image for that phone. And the one that I have downloaded already is Oreo. Why don't we download the latest option, which is Android Q? And so by tapping on Download, Android Studio will download all of the required components for the Android Q system image. And this is a pretty large download, more than 1 gigabyte, so this might take some time. Now that it's finished downloading, we can actually select Q as an option, tap on Next. Here, you can set various configurations for the emulator. You can set a name, and then you can set the default orientation, portrait or landscape. If you click on Advanced Settings, I'll leave everything as a default, but you have a lot of opportunity to modify things here. For example, what you want the front and back camera to show, the network speed, you can actually change it to be like a lower network speed. The performance, if you have more RAM or storage available on your computer, you have options to change that as well. So we're not going to change any of those, but once you're satisfied, then you can tap on Finish. So now the emulator is ready to go. It's created. All we need to do is run the emulator that we just created. So ours is Pixel 2 API 29. And then the emulator itself will take a few seconds or a few minutes to boot up. And you'll know it's done booting up when you see the home screen from Android, which is kind of the default, which has a wallpaper and then a few apps shown. So here's the indication that the emulator is ready to go and booted up. So you have the home screen with a few apps, and you can actually see it looks pretty much like a normal Android phone. And you have options on the right side here to change the orientation, change the volume, make the phone go to sleep, and so on. Now that the emulator is running, you can select that emulator from the option at the top next to the green triangle, which is to run. But this means that we'll be running the Hello World demo activity application on this emulator. So now let's tap on the green triangle, and you can see at the bottom here that Cradle Build is running, and now it's installing. So going back to our phone, you can see that the app is actually pushed onto the emulator. So this is very simple. All we're showing is Hello World. So the typical cycle when you're developing an Android app is that you'll make a change in Android Studio, run the application, verify the change in the emulator, and then repeat the process. So just to show you that that works, what we can do is go into Android Studio, and actually make a change and see it reflected in the emulator. So as we talked about earlier, the UI shown is coming from the hello world activity.java. And what this is doing is setting the content view, which is the UI shown, to be this layout. And this layout is an XML file. So if I command click, if I control click on this layout, it'll jump right to the resource, which is backing that UI. And so we have a relative layout with a text view, and this text view has a text attribute, which is what's actually being shown. And so instead of it showing hello world, let's just make it say CodePath. So now if we rerun the application, so I go into the section where we were able to select the emulator and just tap on that, we should see that the app is rebooted, and instead of hello world, it says CodePath. So this is the typical flow of how we'll be spending the majority of the time in making a change, running the app, and then verifying the change. And so in review, we've done a lot of setup in these videos. In particular, we've downloaded and installed and set up the Android Studio IDE, which is the integrated development environment, where we'll spend most of our time. We've ensured that we have at least a few Android SDKs, software development kits, set up so that we can target particular API versions of Android. We set up Git, which is a version control system used to track the different versions of our project. We use git clone in order to download a starter project. It's our first Android application that we were able to run and deploy. And finally, we set up an Android emulator, and we were able to use Android Studio to take our downloaded project from Git and push it onto the emulator. And we actually made a change on that project. So throughout this class, we'll be going a lot deeper into Android Studio and Android development, but this should give you a good sense of what you'll see going forward.